Good evening. Do I have to turn it on? Good evening. Can you all hear me? Hi, welcome. Welcome. Hello. My name is Gretchen Dietrich. I am the Marcia and John Price Executive Director of this Utah Museum of Fine Arts. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Dumpke Auditorium in the Marcia and John Price Museum building on our campus for tonight's Artist Talk with Cheryl. We're so excited to have her here. So before I begin this evening's program, I would like to acknowledge that the UMFA is situated on land which is named for the Ute tribe and is the unceded, traditional, and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah and the Utah Museum of Fine Arts acknowledge the significance of place and the continued existence and contributions of Indigenous people who have lived on and cared for this land for thousands of years. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes and states and federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah and the UMFA's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to tonight's Artist Talk with Cheryl Derricotte, the 2024 Marva and John Warnock Artist in Residence in the Department of Art History here at the university. We're excited to have Cheryl here tonight, and we are grateful to our colleagues on campus and in Art and Art History for their collaboration on this event and for everything that we are able to do together. We're also very grateful to Salt Lake City Zoo Arts and Parks program, that's the ZAP program, a very good thing, and the University of Utah for their support of programs like this one. Before we get started, I wanted to quickly share about two upcoming special exhibitions that might be of interest to you. Opening on February 24th, Pictures of Belonging, which features the work of three incredible artists, Miki Hayakawa, Hisako Hibi, and Mine Kubo. These women were all active and visible artists of Japanese descent during the World War II generations. Their critically acclaimed careers spanned 8 decades and 4 U.S. states, yet a full extent of their work has been understudied in the 20th century American art history. Pictures of Belonging is an unprecedented reintroduction that features more than 100 artworks by these trailblazers, and many of them which will be on display for the first time. And by tracing their pre-war, wartime, and post-war artistic production, Pictures of Belonging illuminates an expanding view of the American experience by women who used art making to literally take up space and make their presence and existence visible and to assert that they, in fact, belonged. On April 10th, we will open Sonic Blossom, a performance-based art installation by the Taiwanese-American artist Lee Ming-wei, on view here at the museum until May 5th. This project allows local, classically trained singers to offer spontaneous gift of song to our museum visitors. So if that seems interesting to you, come and visit us during that time and see what that's about. I wanted to say how much we've enjoyed getting to know Cheryl. She's a wonderful short-term addition to our campus community, and I think we're all in for a real treat this evening. So thanks so much. Settle in. Remember to silence your cell phone. And it's my pleasure to turn things over here to my wonderful colleague, Dr. Winston Kyan, Associate Professor of Art History here at the U of U. Thanks so much.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Gretchen, for the warm welcome and kind introduction. And thank you for letting us use this amazing space that is the Dumpke Auditorium. I have the honor, as a member of the committee that nominated Cheryl, to introduce her as the 2024 Marva and John Warnock Artist in Residence in the Department of Art and Art History at the University of Utah. I'd like to begin by thanking the late John Warnock and the thriving Marva Warnock for making this biannual residency possible, which allows us to bring nationally recognized artists with urgent artistic perspectives to campus to benefit their own practice, our students, and the broader arts community here in Utah. I'd also like to acknowledge the hard work and vision of the other members of the Warnock Committee, without whom this would not have been possible. Associate Professor Wendy Wisher, Associate Professor Ed Bateman, Chief Curator at the UMFA, Alyssa McCusker, and Director of the UMOCA, Laura Hurtado. Now on to Cheryl, our distinguished speaker tonight. Cheryl holds degrees from Barnard, Cornell, and the California Institute of Integral Studies. Cheryl is a multimedia artist whose favored mediums are glass and paper. She uses these materials to create deeply historical and political projects that question several false distinctions made in art history and in American history. These include the separation of craft from fine art, the divide between the historicity of dominant narratives and the anonymity of marginalized individuals, and the gap between local domesticity and the movement of objects across continents and oceans. I've been following Cheryl's work since December 2020, when we met on an online panel during the pandemic. I was quickly intrigued by her reading of the decor of Thomas Jefferson's Monticello as a mirror of the multiracial reality of the plantation. It has been a pleasure since then to see her work develop into other areas that reclaim history and politically invigorate the medium of glass. Take, for example, Freedom's Threshold, a glass sculptural tribute to Harriet Tubman that was unveiled in March 2023 at the busy Bay Area transportation hub of Millbrae. And the November 2023 solo show installation, Friend of John, which illuminates the life of the 19th century Black capitalist and abolitionist, Mary Ellen Pleasant. Taken together, these projects, along with many others in Cheryl's practice, directly face our cultural moment and what is at stake right now, which is the right to recover our shared histories and the need to critically reevaluate our institutions through free artistic expression. So please join me in welcoming Cheryl Derricotte.
Thank you for that beautiful introduction. I appreciate you all coming tonight, and great, here go the slides. So I'm gonna start on the page and then I'll get off the page because everybody says I'm better off the page, but I don't wanna miss any thank yous. So let me also begin by thanking Mrs. Marva Warnock for the generous gift she and her late husband, Dr. John Warnock, made that makes this residency and lecture possible. Thanks to the Warnock Committee, Professor and Department Chair Kim Martinez, Professor Winston Kyan, and Professor Ed Bateman, as well as the faculty of the Department of Art and Art History for making me feel so very welcome. Thanks to Gretchen Dietrich, Alyssa McCusker, Emily Lawhead, Ashley Farmer, and Erica Sitting Up for making me feel as welcome at the museum as in the department. And a big thank you to all of the behind-the-scenes power brokers in the art department, Lewis Crawford, Sandy Cook, and Sean Porter, and at the library, Luke Leither, Marnie Powers-Torrey, and Emily Tips. I appreciate all of you for getting me settled in. Last but not least, to my TA, Pam Beach, and all of my students, many of whom came tonight, and I thank you. Thank you for joining me in a new course on making that centers our personal and collective memories. When I was talking to Professor Ed Bateman about the timing of this lecture, we agreed that it might be great to do it at the front of the residency, so that way people would know more about me and about my work, and if they wanted to interface or do a studio visit, we'd have some shared understanding about that. And so I always begin my talks in the same place, which is, I stand for art and liberation. I believe that the museum and the gallery are the brave places we need to host difficult dialogues in society. I think art is the vehicle that can get us there. And so I add my own land acknowledgments to Gretchen's. I joined the museum in acknowledging the land we call Salt Lake City, which is really Ute, Paiute, and Shoshone. I acknowledge the land where I live and work. We call it San Francisco, but we know it's Ohlone land. And because we're gonna tell some family stories tonight, I also wanna acknowledge where I was born, a place we call Washington, D.C., which is Anacostan land, and the land of my maternal family side. Some call it Southwest Virginia, or the major metropolis of Withville, and that's with a Y, but it's really the land of the Cherokee Nation. My journey in glass started at a place called the Washington Glass School. It's going pretty good because it's gotten me to the University of Utah Department of Art and Art History. And we're going to talk about the mountain road in the middle. And so these three gentlemen are the co-directors of the Washington Glass School. From the left, Michael Janis; in the middle, Tim Tate; and on the right, Erwin Timmers. And this was the first piece I ever made that anybody took notice of. And I always show it because we all start somewhere, and it's kind of raggedy, but it had a lot of heart. And it also said a lot, I think, about who I was going to be as an artist. Title shed some light. Text and image were always important to me. This was actually a workshop that the Washington Glass School held that was about making sculptural work or lighted sculpture. And I said, oh, I would like to make a house about world poverty. I had been working day jobs and nonprofits, and I was tired of talking to people about world poverty. They didn't seem to get it. And so I thought maybe if I made a sculpture, they would visit with it and they would get it. What I didn't know is that during that workshop, there was a Washington Post reporter embedded in the class that was writing about this new glass studio. So she started following me and Erwin around as I was making this piece. And then we would hold our own shows because nobody was really showing glass in DC at the time. And the Washington Post art critic wrote about my piece. And at that point, Tim Tate, who was the one co-director who actually had a background in glass, said, hey, you, I think you might have a future in this if you settle down, so I want to help you settle down. And I said, oh, okay, that sounds interesting. And he said, you must immediately go to North Carolina and study with this man, pictured at the bottom of this image, Thurman Statham. And he's by far the most famous black glass artist in the US. Thurman spent his sort of teen years into his 20s in Washington, DC, so there was certainly a connection there. But he went to the Rhode Island School of Design and was a ceramics major when Dale Chihuly was starting the original glass program at RISD, so he encouraged Thurman to come over. As you can tell, Thurman also liked to make glass houses, which was the other reason Tim thought it might be a good idea for me to go take his class. I don't know how many of y'all know Western North Carolina. It's a challenging place. So there is Asheville, which is very much the Berkeley of the South. And then it's surrounded by a lot of places that still have a fondness for the Confederate flag. But off I went to this wonderful place, the Penland School of Crafts, which is an oasis in the middle of all of that, about 90 miles up the mountain from Asheville. And it has a studio for everything, including glass. And so it was there that I first learned glass blowing with Thurman Statham, which is still a sentence that makes many people in the glass world double over with laughter. But the piece on the left, I actually made with one of his two TAs, both of whom were great and have emerged as wonderful glass artists in their own right, Dave Nato of Hawaii and Simone Fetzer of Germany. And so you see in this slide some examples of the type of work I made at Penland over the years. I actually went back several times through the last 20 years. And what was interesting about that first work on the left, which is a blown glass tornado, and I called the work Gentrification by Nature, was that it was shown immediately in a museum. So even though I had only been sort of in the art world for a few minutes very early on, it was established that I was a museum artist. This work was shown at the Tallahassee Museum of Fine Arts in a show called Terrestrial Forces. I'm a firm believer that when the time is right, the right opportunity will appear, and like magic, that opportunity appeared. The other two pieces are examples of the type of work that I still do, kind of mixed media books, which is more coal work, and then on the bottom, enamel work. I do a lot of work with powders in glass. And so flash forward, and I finally said, I am going to go back for the MFA. I always wanted to do it. I'm going to do it. And so while I was doing my MFA from 2013 to 2015, the British Library dumped 1 million images into the public domain. And that was an amazing thing for artists. And I'm sure there are many people here who also took advantage of that opportunity. And I had recently made a glass boat, and I said, oh, I wonder what historic boat images will come up. So I'm in there typing boat, and what happened? And lo and behold, here comes slave ships. And I'm like, here we go. And one of the things I've really learned about my work is that it is intuitive, and I just stay with it. And so wherever the inquiry seems to lead, I don't necessarily try to drive that. I put in boats, I got slave ships, I was gonna sit with that for a minute. And so while I was in school, I began to make these small works, and these are small. I mean, these works were like 5 by 7, in glass and on paper, using these historic images of formerly enslaved people and also slave ships. By the time I graduated school, an opportunity came along to apply for a solo show at the Museum of the African Diaspora for emerging artists on the occasion of the museum's 10th anniversary. And much to my great joy, I got one of the 2 shows. And I had never done a solo show before, much less at a beautiful museum. And I figured out that I needed to do a few things to really fill up the space because I had never filled up that much space. So one whole wall was just works, portraits of formerly enslaved people in glass that I did enamel work. And then because it was a big room, I also had a video, and on the other wall, I had a number of works on paper that were either slave ships that I rendered in white ink on navy blue paper to give you the sense of the ocean, or more brown paper to give you the sense of labor, so plantation life scenes. And this is a detail of some of the work, so you can see how I took these historic images and translated them into glass. I want to make a point of calling out the image on the bottom right of the screen. You know, at the time, everyone was talking about hands up, don't shoot, and I wanted people to see that this was not a new phenomenon. Here was an old image from the 1800s in a novel of a black person with their hands up saying don't shoot. And so moving on, the second piece I want to talk to you about, which Winston mentioned in his very generous and warm introduction, is the monument I worked on for Harriet Tubman. And so this is about competition. About 5 years after I was out of school, I was invited to apply to a competition to develop a monument to Harriet Tubman. And by that point, I was known as somebody who brought to life the portraits of formerly enslaved people through glass, and I think that's how I got on the list. And so I sent in this proposal. What you see on the left is an image of me in front of Harriet Tubman's actual home. That's the side profile of her home in Auburn, New York. And my design on the right was based on the side profile of the house using the constraint which the developer gave, which was a 4-foot footprint for the sculpture. And in the middle, you see the rendering of ultimately what the property was gonna look like after this new town was developed at the Millbrae BART. And I quickly realized that I had now won a major commission and my 125 square foot studio was way too small. And so I moved. And fortunately, there was an opening in a place called Islayas Creek Studios in San Francisco. And I moved in just in time. And so these are some images of my studio. You see my kiln, which is like close to 6 feet long, which was also part of the reason I was bursting out of my 125 square foot studio after I bought that. In the middle, you see the site visit with the developer and his SVP, and you can see Harriet Tubman's image actually laid out on the floor because I had enough studio to lay out 12 feet of work in time for them to visit. And then I had to move all the glass to marry it with my fabricator. And so my fabricator, who has the cap on in the top right, TJ Marone, runs a company called Eclipse Designs in Petaluma. And so I packed up all the glass after it was finished to take it to Petaluma to install into the frame that he and his team had built out of aluminum. And so you see a lot of pictures of me with the team, me laying out the actual glass work. You can see I've got it all numbered to make sure it's in the right place. Fortunately, my friend Chandler asked questions and he says, Cheryl, how long is it going to take you to put together? And I said, I don't know. I've never done it before, maybe 2 or 3 days. And he said, well, aren't there people putting it together? I said, honey, I'm the people. What are you talking about? And he was like, okay, I'm handy. I'll fly up. I was like, thank you. So he flew up and you see him helping tape up the frame and he helped me get it all caulked in, which was great. And then, you know, you think it's done, but really you're just getting ready for the crane because now you have to move it from Petaluma to Millbrae and get it in position, which we did. And, you know, the woman smiling with me, I'm like, and when it was over, the happiest 2 women on the planet were Evie Simon, who was the developer's art consultant, and me, because up until that point, there had been torrential rain every single day for 2 weeks. So we weren't sure we were going to get it in time. And so it was unveiled on March 16th, and you can see, you know, again for scale, I'm 5'5", the sculpture is a little over 12 feet, and how it looks in position in relationship to the new development. One of the things that was important to me was to use a transparent brown glass. That way Harriet Tubman's image is fully visible whether or not you are facing the train station or if you're riding the train and facing the buildings. Everyone is going to get a view of Harriet Tubman. There's no such thing as a front or a back to my sculpture. The other thing I'll say about the sculpture, which you kind of can see in this picture but not as clearly, at the very bottom there are actually 14 brick-like shapes. And they are the size of conventional bricks, 2 by 8 1/4, not as thick as a conventional brick, but they are etched with words that pertain to Harriet Tubman's life. And this was an opportunity to include community in the creation of the sculpture. One of the reasons that I designed the sculpture based on the profile of Harriet Tubman's home is that a lot of people don't realize that Harriet Tubman owned 32 acres of property, that there were probably 5 buildings at the time of her death on that property, and she left it all to her local AME Zion Church. So a lot of times we have a conversation about Harriet Tubman on the Underground Railroad, the legendary conductor. Some people say she died poor, and I'm like, if you got 32 acres and 5 buildings, you don't sound poor. You might be cash poor, but that's a lot of assets. And you know, the fact that you had the foresight to donate that to your church is a conversation about philanthropy and giving that we need to be having when we talk about her legacy. And so to select the actual words, I made sort of a starter list, and then I reached out to the local AME Zion Church in San Mateo County, and they were very excited to learn about the project and happy to jump on Zoom and work on this. And then I also reached out to a number of artists I knew who were also veterans and asked for their opinion. And they gave me some words. And then I went back to the church, and the church didn't like a couple of the words the veterans liked. And I was like, church, we can't take away the veterans' words. They didn't get to take away your words. And they're like, okay. And, you know, there was a lot of discussion about that. But ultimately, everyone was happy, and we felt like we picked 14 words that represented the breadth of her life. And so shifting to a different project now. This is a photo of Twin Peaks. This will be very funny given that we're in Utah, but these are the mountains in San Francisco. They are 925 feet high. So that's where we go hiking. I know, I hear the laughs, it's okay. But those are actually the second tallest mountains in the city. There's one that's 928 feet, it's 3 feet taller. But anyway, during the pandemic, you know, like many people, I really valued my time outdoors. And so I went on a hike with my friend William Sallet, who's a wonderful painter. And he said, have you ever been around the rear of the reservoir side of Twin Peaks? I said, why, no. And so we're just hiking, you know, la-di-da. And the smell, and I'm like, well, what is that smell? And he's like, oh, that's the eucalyptus trees. And I said, well, why are there eucalyptus trees in San Francisco? And he's like, oh, they're everywhere. And I'm like, really? And so I go home, and me and Dr. Google, why are there eucalyptus trees in San Francisco? And one of the things that comes up is the smallest park in San Francisco. And so this is a view of about 4 of 6 eucalyptus trees that exist at the corner of Octavia and Bush Street. And it turns out that the smallest park in San Francisco actually has a plaque that was laid by the African American Historic and Cultural Society in the 1970s commemorating the mother of civil rights, Mary Ellen Pleasant. And I was like, I don't know anything about this woman. I didn't know anything about these trees. This is interesting. Where are we going? And we started going down the journey of learning about Mary Ellen Pleasant. So this was the mansion that she used to live in with Thomas Bell, her business partner, who was a Scottish financier of the Bank of California board, and his wife and 6 children. A lot of people thought that Mary Ellen Pleasant and Thomas Bell were a couple. Maybe if it wasn't 1850, it might have gone that way, but it didn't. So she introduced him to his wife, and she was the house manager and business partner for a number of properties that they owned in common. That is part of the reason the house has always been referred to as the old Bell Mansion, but everyone knew that she built this 38-room mansion. She oversaw the construction and all of the interior design. And those skinny little trees are what ended up being those fat eucalyptus trees that we saw in the previous image. And so this is the only confirmed known picture of Mary Ellen Pleasant. She was 87, and it was a couple of years before her death. One of the fascinating sidebars about her is that there's often a picture shown of her that in fact is Queen Emma of Hawaii, and there was a major lawsuit between the state of Hawaii. The San Francisco Historical Society had to weigh in, an author who wrote a number of sensationalist publications about her that said, no, it is Mary Ellen Pleasant. And everybody said, no, it's not, it's Queen Emma. So it was a big brouhaha. But this picture is actually her and has been verified as her. Mary Ellen Pleasant was the richest woman during the gold rush. She was a multimillionaire. She also owned property in Napa, which is still functioning as a winery today, and they share the history of her ownership in all of the winery's publications, the Beltane Ranch in Sonoma. And she is buried in Napa on property of friends after she died that she stayed with. And so she was a staunch abolitionist her whole life, which is part of the reason the plaque calls her the mother of civil rights. And one of the things she did was give John Brown $30,000 to $40,000 toward the raid on Harper's Ferry. And so in today's terms, that would be $900,000 to $1 million. It was a lot of money. She also was part of a lawsuit against what we now call Muni to attempt to desegregate transit. She did a joint lawsuit with 2 white women to try to desegregate Muni, and this was at least 100 years before anybody had ever heard of Rosa Parks. So she was very aggressive in her abolition, and both her first and second husbands had been staunch abolitionists as well. And so from an artistic standpoint, I had a very long delayed residency in New Orleans. And by the time it was 2 years later, I got to the residency, they were like, you probably have a different idea. I said, actually, I do. There's this woman I found out about, and it sounds like her second husband was from New Orleans, so I'd like to dive into that a little more. And they said, sure, go ahead. And so the first piece I made was this 3-color screen print that traces her journey from the North, because she pretty much grew up in Nantucket as an indentured servant from childhood to a Quaker family, and then to Boston as a young woman where she learned tailoring. And so that white line is a bit of an artistic liberty I took with what was actually the boat route, because people would get on those big steamships, like the one pictured at the bottom, which were actually how the mail was being moved back and forth across the country. And because there was no Panama Canal, these trips would take forever, because you would come down, you of course stop in the port of New Orleans, then you'd keep going all the way around South America, around Texas. Eventually you'd end up in California. And in the case of this ship, it would dead end in Oregon with the mail. So if you were firing up that much ship for mail, you were not going to leave any vacant space on the boat. You were going to put people, animals, whatever else you could to make that worth your while. It is thought that that might be where Mary Ellen Pleasant actually met Thomas Bell, was on the journey across from the East Coast to California, because everybody was trying to get to California based on the gold rush. In her case, it was twofold. One, having grown up in Nantucket, worked in stores, you know, from a young age as a child all the way into adulthood through a major whaling boom. She was a person that understood boom and how to make money. So she wanted to get to California for the gold rush because she knew the kind of support businesses that would be financially lucrative in the midst of a boom. Also, California came into the Union technically a free state. So if one got there ostensibly in 1850, there was hope that you wouldn't be sent back to some place that was a slave state. And then the other work that I made were two artist books. The one on the left was actually a prototype for a hardcover linen-bound book. That was only an edition of 12, and it paired historical images with text from her actual interviews. I should stop and say one of the challenging things about historical figures, particularly those who have been vilified or sensationalized in the news, is trying to figure out what you're really working with. And I drew a line in the sand for truth. And to me, truth was what she said in interviews about her life. And so all of the text are her actual words. And then I did my usual thing between the British Library or the Huntington Library, finding historical images that I wanted to pair with the text, and using images that were in the public domain, obviously, because no artist should step on any other artist's copyright. The second book that one is still in print, and actually is going to be at Codex Book Fair coming up in February in Oakland, California. But 21 Lessons is much more of a popular culture take, and so I wrote sort of contemporary words that would pair her words. So in this case, lesson 21 was to define your legacy, and she actually did say, all I want on my tombstone is that she was a friend of John Brown. And so by now, I think you're seeing that I have a heavily research-based practice. I get into these stories, I try to see where it's going, I'm looking at historical documents. And after coming back from New Orleans, I stayed with her story, and over the course of the last year, began to add glass and textiles. And so I did her portrait in glass. This piece is about, I think it's 18 by 22, somewhere in that neighborhood. I also did John Brown. I actually love this picture of John Brown. I think in history, we often see John Brown as this wild-haired, crazy-looking man, you know, coming off the raid of Harper's Ferry, but we forget that he was a minister. He was a man of deep faith. He did not take it lightly to take up arms in the cause of freedom. So I wanted to show John Brown in a more dignified way. And then one of the things she said was that, you know, she ran a boarding house on Washington Street, and she set the best table. And so I actually made table settings. And so I made the nesting glass plates, and I also made the napkins using a photograph of eucalyptus leaves that I gathered from the park in San Francisco. And the glasses themselves are actually hand blown by my friend Jerry Kung, who's a glass blower in Oakland. And, you know, it's art, so I made it up. I was like, if you're setting the best table and your business partner is a Scottish financier on the Bank of California board, you're gonna be pouring a good old label like Macallan. So I put a bottle of Macallan on the table, you know, to give it that feel. And so here is a view of my whole show. And the show is up November through December in San Francisco. And the textile piece is actually, you know, bringing to life the old photograph of the home, because I wanted people to feel like when they step through the door of my show or of the installation, they were definitely going back in time to the 1880s. So representation, let's look at the work that was actually on the flyer. I was invited to do a show called Not Grandma's Glass, #NGG, by Habitat Gallery. This is a show, well, Habitat is America's oldest glass gallery, based in Royal Oak, Michigan. And they actually do online presentations of new artists that they're kind of testing out, you know, because they carry like all the glass work of all the famous glass masters. So if you're a person who's interested in glass, go look at their website sometime and just see some beautiful stuff. But part of Not Grandma's Glass was that you agreed you would make a suite of 5 new works specifically for the gallery to sell, and you would also do an online talk, because again, we're still deep in pandemic time, so we're coming up with online programming. And I was invited to do it, and the gallery owner said, oh, make work like you would want in like your favorite museum. And I was like, gosh, at the time, I was actually getting ready to go to Corning on a residency. So I said, well, maybe Corning would want this work. I don't know. But it would be some kind of major glass museum that would want this work. So I also was thinking a lot about the legacy of Black glass artists, because I think that, like many places, you know, people in the glass world, arts organizations, studios, they were definitely having reflection after George Floyd too, about how many artists were there showing, who worked on their teams, who was on the board, all of the things. And so I stumbled upon these pictures of these children who worked in glass factories, and I still can't believe we say that sentence, but yes, children who worked in glass factories at the turn of the last century. So this was like the 1920s. And as you see in this first image, and all four of these boys were Black. And then I kept going. And here's a picture that has boys who are mixed race. And so I was very struck by the fact that I was seeing these images of children that were mixed race, even though clearly America was highly segregated in the 1920s. Capitalism was not and could care less, you know. I also found the backstory of the photographs equally interesting. These were all taken by a photographer named Lewis Hine, who had been commissioned by a foundation to go undercover and like really ferret out child labor in the US in the hopes of reform. And Lewis Hine did wonderful work and was a contemporary of like Dorothea Lange and Walker Evans and Gordon Parks. However, Roy Stryker, who was the head of Farm Security Administration, for whatever reason, didn't like him. So he never gave him a job. And so even though, you know, he had done this great work documenting child labor, he didn't go on to, you know, the kind of success in the future that those other photographers did. And so we were talking a lot about the lack of Black glass artists. Where are all the Black glass artists? And I'm like, here they are, been hiding in plain sight for 100 years, can't miss them. Here they are. And, you know, I love them so much. I mean, they clearly, you know, the other thing about these boys is that when you get a little closer to the imagery, you begin to understand this was also about ethnicity in class. So, you know, our construction of whiteness wasn't quite the same in the 1920s, and you begin to see that these boys were not just Black, but they were Irish, and they were Jewish, and they were Italian American, you know, and here they all are, and even though, you know, they're tiny, they're all attitude, they are glass blower, you know, and I'm just like, okay, I see you all. And so shifting gears, I had a family, and the person on the left was my mom, beautiful, and you know, my mom really, I think I could summarize it by saying artist was not her first choice. She might have used a word like lawyer if she could have picked a word, or doctor, you know, doctor was a word she was very fond of. And if it hadn't been for my grandmother, I would have not known that in fact my mother had been a musician. She had met my father, who was also a musician, in band, like in junior high school, years before they ever started dating, got married, and had me. And this same person who only could say lawyer or doctor and never understood how she got a daughter who was an artist and activist used to take me in my stroller to civil rights marches, much to my grandmother's dismay. But none of this ever came out of my mother, so I was glad my grandmother could tell me these stories. And then the couple on the right were actually my great aunt and uncle, great aunt Teeny and great uncle Irvin, and they loved glass. So years before I ever thought about being a glass artist, I grew up in a family that loved glass. We were the kind of people that when the annual PBS show came on and it was the Blinky Glass Factory in West Virginia, we would stop and drop and watch the whole show, and they'd get snacks, you know? I mean, they just loved everything about glass, both, high-end glass or like more, commercial glass that they would find antiquing. And so holidays to them was give me a piece of Waterford crystal if you love me. I mean, they were just really deeply involved with glass. And so after years of my mother, no, you're not an artist, no, you're not a musician, no, you're none of the things, and I announced, oh my gosh, I took this glass class. I love it so much. I'm going to go to North Carolina. I just love glass. And my mother's shaking her head. And Aunt Tina and Uncle Irvin went, glass! We love glass. And, I just watched the color drain from my mother because elders had spoken, so she knew she had lost the war in that moment. And so it's the pandemic. We're all in the house. I was invited to do a show at the French Consulate that was supposed to be in August of 2020. We know how that ended up. And we ended up making work to present online. And a part of the show at the French Consulate had originally been designed to host French artists. They had built a beautiful new residency facility. They were planning on bringing French artists overseas. Nobody could fly. And they said, oh, do the local artists want to stay in the residency? And I was like, leave my living room and stay in the mansion for a week? Yes, please sign me up for that. And so I ended up going to stay for 1 week. It was the ground floor of the French Consulate, and it was a beautiful new 2-bedroom apartment. There were JR murals. There was an original photograph of the Black Panther women by Agnes Varda. It's unbelievable. And they just said, make up programs. And so at the time, the curator, Candace Huey, who would later become my gallerist, said, oh, can you make up some programs? And I said, sure. I'm going to make this work about Thomas Jefferson, and is that okay? And she was like, yeah, that's okay. I said, okay, because, he was challenging. And she's like, no, I wanted somebody to complicate the conversation. I said, okay, here we go. And so I did this combination of Instagram post with the work. And so literally, I would post the black square on Instagram with this story. And this is true. My mother's maiden name was Jefferson. And a big part of her life, she always wanted to prove that we were related to Thomas Jefferson. I was not as interested in that as my mother was, but I started the story there. The piece on the right is the first part of the triptych I made about Thomas Jefferson, and I replaced the actual flower that was in this old wallpaper with wheat because a lot of his interest in growing wheat in Monticello at the plantation was to really have the French bread that he loved so much when he was in France. And so this was also true. Those folks I mentioned, and when I did the land acknowledgement, the major metropolis of Wytheville in Wythe County, Virginia, was less than 3 hours from Monticello. So you're kind of like, maybe mommy was right. I don't know. Maybe we were related to him. And I kept sharing these stories of like family history, of going back to visit Wytheville with my family, all of these things. And, people were riveted because remember, it's the pandemic. We can't get out the house. And my best friends were like, Cheryl, who are you? You didn't tell us any of these stories. I said, you never asked me any of these stories, And so you see the wheat prominently displayed in the second panel of the triptych. And then the wolf. And the reason I picked the wolf was twofold. The wolf is very much a storied creature in a lot of French literature through the ages, both, old fables as well as like more contemporary people like Genet, who talks about the space between Le Loup and Le Chien. I mean, the wolf is all over the place. And so Thomas Jefferson also talked about the wolf. And in this quote, he's actually using the wolf as a metaphor for the institution of slavery. And he used this phrase more than once, including during the Missouri Compromise. And so it was really clear that he knew slavery was wrong, but this whole notion of not being able to safely let him go, and the quote goes on to say, self-preservation is in one hand, and justice is in the other. And so he stayed on the side of self-preservation. And so there's the full triptych together, and the work, each panel is 11 by 14, so the work is 33 by 42. And I also picked an image of Jefferson at about the age he was when he became the father of 6 children with Sally Hemings. I didn't really want to show Jefferson any older than that. I think it's enough that he was 41 and she was 16. We didn't need to, know more than that at the time. And so I made a point of picking an image that was timed right. The other thing about these images is that I actually did this in an edition of 6, so one for each of the children that they had together. And out of starting this work at the French consulate, to talk about Jefferson, who had been, clearly one of our most notorious ambassadors at the time to France, that, it opened a conversation as well about what things in French culture had definitely influenced us in the US, and a big part of that was cuisine. And so Thomas Jefferson's enslaved chef, James Hemings, had actually gone to France with him a few years before Sally Hemings, James's younger sister, came over as the slave for one of Jefferson's daughters. And so again, by pulling us into this wheat, because James Hemings trained as a French chef, he knew all the things about baking, it was an opportunity for us to build an online program centered around food while we were at the consulate. And so one of the things we did was have a conversation with chefs. Chef Tanya Holland, who is a well-known Black American chef who trained in France, so she was deeply familiar with James Hemings' story and how he rose to be chef de cuisine at a time when a lot of French people couldn't make it through the kitchen to be chef de cuisine, as well as Chef Brenda Bienviager, who is a Filipina-American chef who does traditional Creole cooking. So she shared with us the long history of Filipino communities in New Orleans, which a lot of us knew nothing about. And that's a long-winded way of saying, nations can't outrun their genes. We can't get away from our stories. It's important for us to own all the stories and sit with them. And even though, these two nations' fraught histories continue to shape our understanding in a lot of cases about racism and the Black diaspora, whether it's in New Orleans or other parts of the country, it was really important for me to tell these stories, particularly for younger generations of people who were trying to understand how in the world we had a major race riot in Charlottesville and people actually got killed. And I said, well, it's got something to do with a major plantation being a few miles away that used to be the home of a former president. We got a lot of work to do. And so I started looking into the Hemings side now as sort of which way forward. And so when I got to Corning on residency, I took the opportunity to dive into James Hemings and start to figure out, well, what would a picture of James look like? Because unlike Thomas Jefferson, where we have many images at many different ages, there are no known photographs of James or Sally Hemings. And so for James, what you see in the back is actually a large glass panel that I made. It's 36 inches that has his handwriting. This is the only known saved handwriting of James Hemings, and it was an inventory of all of the kitchen utensils at the Monticello plantation. And then partnering with glass blowers, we started pulling out elements of this inventory to render them in blown glass. And so that's why you see a very sizable black cast iron skillet that's actually blown glass black. And so, you know, in this way, I feel like my work is extending the conversation of portraiture from just sort of it's your traditional drawn portrait or a photograph portrait into what is a conceptual portrait. How can we share a picture of people that we don't have any pictures of whatsoever? And so in Utah, where are we going in Utah? So as you can tell, a lot of my work is very intuitive. And when I applied for the Warnock residency, I had proposed doing research about the bison. I wanted to find something interesting about Utah. I was terribly interested to learn that the second and third largest herds of bison in the US are actually in the state of Utah. And lo and behold, a week after I sent my proposal, on the top right, the New York Times had a major article about the bison. And I was like, Cheryl, it is a sign, get ready, the bison, okay? And then when I got the call for my interview, it was actually, can you do it on your birthday? And I'm like, okay, universe, I hear you. I guess I might really be going to Utah. Okay, Utah, bison, you know? And so here we are, which is amazing. So while I'm here, I am gonna learn more about the bison. I've just started, you know, to poke around and see what I could find. And what was interesting was to learn that the original 12 bison were brought to Antelope Island in like 1893. 3 years later, the Buffalo Soldiers came to Utah. And I said, well, that's interesting. And so I don't know what story may come out of this, but clearly there's some timing there that suggests to me there may be a story to be shared artistically about how, you know, Anglo, Indigenous, and Black community were functioning in the time of the bison in the 1890s. We'll just see where that all goes. And then last but not least, after Utah, I'll just be continuing work on the Hemings project. I have the Glass Boys, 2 of the Glass Boys portraits are on view now at the Museum of Glass in Tacoma. So if any of you are in the Seattle, Tacoma area, please visit that show through October 27th. And if you just happen to be there July 17th through 21st, I'll be the guest artist in the Hot Shop. And I'm gonna start work on Sally Hemings' portrait. I think we're gonna make some sculptural versions to tell sort of her story or create her portrait because she was a seamstress. So part of her job was to take care of all the family's clothes in the Jeffersons household. That's all I got for you. I am happy to take questions. Thank you so very much for having me. Thank you for coming tonight. And Ashley's got the mic. I see a hand there. Mm-hmm.
Could you talk a little bit about the framework of the class you're teaching?
Yes. So the framework of the class is basically making, talking, documenting, and writing. So the course is called The Construction of Memory, Monuments and Utopias. And what we're doing are a series of exercises to open up personal memories so that the students start making and understand how their personal memories, like the family stories I shared tonight, can be unlocked in their art making. Also, we're just getting ready to dive into what is utopia and what is the artist's role in utopia. But throughout history, there certainly have been a number of artists involved in utopian communities. And so that's also a way for me to introduce the role of real estate in one's art career and how one thinks about, whether it's your studio or where you live, and if you do that collectively. So that's kind of the structure of the class. So it's a mix of lectures and making.
Thank you for your wonderful talk. I enjoyed it immensely.
Thank you.
How do you get photographs on glass? I don't understand the process, so maybe that's something you can clarify some of this with. Thank you.
Sure. So have you ever seen a t-shirt being made? Great. So and one says yes, one says no. Okay. Well, basically, first of all, let's say thank you again, Dr. Warnock. With the magic of Photoshop, you can clean up an old historic image that can get exposed onto a screen. And then in turn, with that screen, I use powdered glass through the screen to then put the image on sheet glass. And so depending on how many colors I want to use, that's going to tell you how many screens. Like those Glass Boy images is like 5 screens per image because each color is a different screen.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then you must fire it.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Oh yeah, no, and so each firing, like again, just looking at the Glass Boys, each firing is 27 to 30 hours per layer. Mm-hmm. Thank you. I see what, oh, mm-hmm. Okay, here and then way back there. Mm-hmm.
What I'm wondering is, what informs, well, I think for every artist, we sort of gravitate to the medium that we are used to and we like. But in your case, what informs the decision to render something in glass versus on paper?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that question. I am finding more and more that I actually like people's portraits in glass. I think it becomes kind of self-reflective in terms of glass has been used for, say, daguerreotype, or glass has also been used in some other printmaking processes, more contemporary. So I definitely tend to lean toward the selection of glass when I'm doing either a historical portrait of some type. I think my work on paper more so has to do with bookmaking or printmaking, particularly the bookmaking. I just find myself gravitating that way when it seems like, gosh, this is a subject, say the Mary Ellen Pleasant books, those books were not going to translate into one glass piece or 2 glass pieces even. It's like it's a book that would be better suited to that material. Mm-hmm. Yes, in the back.
Hi.
Hi.
How does your internal process change as your external environment changes? You moved around a lot, and what stays the same and what changes about your process?
Mm-hmm. I would say, well, first of all, I would say going on residency, I think, always helps me pull myself out of all the day-to-day stuff. And that's not to say you don't do some day-to-day stuff depending on the residency. Like this is a residency where clearly I still cook, I still do laundry, I still do all the things. But there are some residencies where you don't do any of those things, so you get like a whole new brain space about it. I think the internal shift, I think, comes from just being out of whatever the normal routine is and the normal paths I take, whether that's the drive I normally take to the studio or the place I go to exercise or those types of things. I think the internal stuff doesn't always shift as much. I think externally, The work I make, I don't find it shifts in terms of maybe the scope or the way I compose the work, but it very well may change the scale of the work. You know, the work may get bigger, or the work may need to come out as books or a triptych or multiples, you know. So I think that's the difference with what happens to the work externally when I pull myself out of my normal studio environment. I also, because I do such heavy research on the work, I've gotten really comfortable with the fact that it just takes as long as it takes. You know, there was like a 2.5 year process of finally getting that Mary Ellen Pleasant work to fruition as a show with like 16 pieces in it. You know, that didn't happen overnight. I wasn't sure when I started the work that it's going to need to be a full show, but that's what needed to happen.
Hi. So my impression is that throughout a lot of history, there's been this sort of construction of artistic mediums that presents things like marble, stone sculptures, metalwork, as you know, that's where the art happens. And though, of course, there's plenty of art that existed in fabric mediums and glass mediums and so on, it hasn't been held in the same esteem, looked at with the same sort of perspective. And that as of more recent years, that's come more and more into light as not a sort of lower, that's craft, that's just mechanical work, but appreciated as the art it is. Mm-hmm. And obviously the work you do draws a lot on glass art, fabric arts, and so on. And I was wondering if you could speak to the position that those mediums have in the art world.
Thank you. I think more and more people are accepting all media in contemporary art. You know, I've certainly came out of a tradition of glass makers that were always interested in sculpture and in narrative. You know, that was very much a part of all of my teachers. So I think I'm certainly of that mindset too. You know, it was those plates that I made for the Mary Ellen Pleasant installation were probably the first plates I had made in 20 years. Because I'm not a plate maker, you know, there's nothing wrong with plates, but it was more so tied to what's gonna make this whole installation hang together. And so I think more and more we're seeing a bit of crossover, and it doesn't, you know, people don't have to be so medium specific anymore. It can be accepted in a variety of places. So if they're showing sculpture, chances are high they may show glass sculpture as soon as they might show stone sculpture or metal sculpture, that type of thing. I mean, I think there's still a certain amount of nervousness with people who haven't shown a lot of glass. They're like, oh my gosh, the glass might break, you know. And yeah, you make another one, you know. I mean, so I think it's becoming more common as opposed to less common. Mm-hmm. Yes.
You talked about your process being really intuitive and kind of flowing. I mean, that takes a lot of trust. Do you have any thoughts? And it could actually be really anxiety-provoking for a lot of people. Do you have any thoughts for maybe younger artists who don't have the experience of how do you make that transition to be able to do something, to work like that? Mm-hmm.
Well, I think, thank you for that question. I think it begins by using your time in school to generate as many ideas as you possibly can. I mean, a lot of these projects that you saw early in my career come into fruition were ideas that I had in grad school, but I hadn't had the time to sort of say, oh, now this is going to be a show somewhere, or now this is going to be a body of work. So I would say if you have an idea about something you want to make it, file it away. You know, I don't consider any of it lost ideas. It just may not end up being a show or whatever. And I think over time, as artists, we begin to know our practice better, particularly in the face of the other things we have to do, like the cooking, the laundry, the teaching, all the things. And so, you know, I think as we mature as artists, I tell people all the time, there is absolutely no reason for me to go to the studio and think I'm going to change over a kiln if I have less than 60 to 90 minutes. I'm just setting myself up for heartache. I need 60 to 90 minutes to take the work out gently, clean the kiln, get it reset for another firing. You know, I don't even go, if I don't have 3 hours to cut and clean glass, I'm wasting my time. Something's gonna break when I score it, you know. So I think you also learn not just, you know, the subject matter that you're leaning into intuitively, but your process for working and how to be effective as well in the studio.
All right. Thank you again. Thank you so much.
Thank
Cheryl.
you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you.
And you all, if folks would like to stick around and chat with Cheryl in our lobby area out there, please feel free to spend some time out there and have conversation with each other and conversation with our special guests tonight.